You can go ahead,
I got a
Darth
question
Corey.
for it. Yeah.
Sure.
So, are you familiar with how many gods the Native Americans have?
How many gods? Probably a
Yeah.
bunch.
Yeah, it's like in the 600s. So let's go with like 650. Do you know how many gods the Muslims have?
Just one, I guess, depending on how you.
Correct, yeah. I could go on, but to save time, let's say there's 999 gods that you don't believe in because you're
Mm-hmm.
Christian. I don't believe in 1,000 gods because I don't believe in your God either. So you're 99% atheist. You're almost all the way there.
Mm-hmm.
You just got to get rid of one more God.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I mean
I
that
mean,
that is literally the definition of being a monotheist, is just believing in one God. So
yeah, so what makes your one God any more real than all these other made up gods that you think are stupid,
I
right?
think there's better evidence for my God, essentially.
That's what all of the other 999 would say as well, though,
Yeah, but
especially the
they're wrong.
Mormons. And that's what they say as well. Everything that you could say
That is
to me
what they
right
say, but
now,
they're actually
they
wrong.
will say as well.
Right, but I mean that
So,
doesn't really mean anything. Like you could have two people who disagree on,
The
one person
narcissism.
says 2 + 2 = 4, another person says 2 + 2 = 5. You know, both of
no,
them
you're
will
also saying
really,
that
That's a
they're
really think
political
they're
argument
right.
right now,
It doesn't
actually.
matter. One of them is still right. And obviously in the religion case, there is the possibility that both are wrong.
yeah,
But
so I mean, like, what are the odds that yours is the correct one and that you just weren't born into it and you were taught it by your parents? Like, if you were born in India, you would believe in that religion
yeah,
because that's what you were raised in.
yeah.
That's
Well,
I
what I'm
guess like
saying.
yeah.
what
If
would
you're
you say is like the
That's
more
not always
proof
true.
of
That's
for
not always
Christianity
yeah, if you're
versus like
for one,
Hinduism?
if
I
you're
wasn't born in any religion,
if
and I'm
you're
Christian.
looking at odds
Well,
on
it's a statistical anomaly, but it does happen.
if you're looking
Sorry.
at odds on the basis of, like, let's
Kinda
say
like
there's
what you're saying.
1,000 gods,
So
and
statistics.
what's
So what you just said was the small statistic can be real. Is what you just said.
It's an anomaly, but it's not
Sorry,
the average.
Keegan.
Yeah.
If you're going on statistics, as far as, like, you have 1,000 gods and you're just pulling a slot machine basically to see which is true, then obviously it'd be 1 in 1,000 chance of my God being true. But that is before looking at the evidence for different gods. Once you look at the evidence, you might have adjust your probabilities based on the evidence of a God being true or not.
Well, I think. No, I understand what you're saying. I think you're missing the point, though. My point is, what if it's 0 in 1,000, though?
What
You're
if what
already
is 0 in 1,000?
99% atheist because you don't believe in all those other gods. So what's just one more?
I mean,
and
one
for the
more
record,
is
I used to be.
one more is every God I believe in. I mean, I don't
Yeah.
really get the point of the argument. Like, you're just defining what monotheism is, which is belief in one God. Like, yes, I am
No,
a monotheist.
So for the record, I was Christian my whole life, went to a Christian university, read the Bible through 3 times, which most Christians have never even read it through once. And I studied hermeneutics as a part of my bachelor's. All that, I'm saying that not to brag or anything. I'm saying that so that I'm genuine, like, about it. The point isn't, oh, I know Jesus is monotheist. The point is, you got to realize, how do I say it? Like, it's not odds based. It's just like a lot of Christians say it's impossible. Like, atheism is a religion in itself. When in reality, Christianity is just one of 50 TV channels on the TV, and atheism is like coming over here and walking to the TV and just unplugging it and realizing all the TV is crap.
Yeah, I mean, I get it. Like, atheism is a little bit different than any kind of theism, whether it's some whether it's Christianity, Islam, or some Native American religion. But still, I mean, you can look at the evidence for each, including atheism, but for each of the other world
Like
religions, and evaluate
I mean,
them.
like, you don't have to get too in detail, but like specifically, like, what evidence, like what like dismantles Hinduism? I mean, you can say like, hey, well, Native American religions, like, it's just word of mouth. There's not really like a lot of substance behind
Native
just
American
word of
religions are
mouth.
pretty BS.
Like, Hinduism is ancient. Hinduism is very, very ancient, possibly even more ancient than Christianity or not Judeo like beliefs.
It is.
And then there's even more beliefs that are even more ancient than that, like Christianity. Not Christianity, like Judeo. I don't even want to say Judeo, but like those belief systems, like from the Middle East,
Like the
those are
Abrahamic
even systemic
religions, maybe.
from.
They're pretty new.
They're
They're really
they
new.
they come from even more ancient religions. Like what
Yeah.
do they call it? Is it can't remember, like, not Babylonian. What's the other? Sumerian. They come from like Sumerian mythologies. Even is where a lot of the Judeo beliefs come from. Are
Yeah,
those
so
gods that are even more ancient, lesser?
Yeah, I think your original question was like how do I know, or what evidence would I bring or look at to show that my religion is more evidential, I guess, than others. I mean, for Hinduism, for example, like there's a central claim of Christianity. Well, I don't know. There's different things you could look at, like how well, just in a multifaceted type of way, does Christianity explain the world versus Hinduism. And you can look at like the central claims of a religion to see like how true they are and if they're like exclusive to others. So I mean, for an example, even if you just compared like Christianity's central claim of the resurrection versus, I don't even know, Hinduism's central claim would maybe be reincarnation. I'm not sure, like that reincarnation's a real thing. But yeah, I mean, I think
I think the easy way to say what you're trying to say is there's no way to disprove religion. Like, you can't prove that it's false because you can't prove a negative.
Yeah, in a sense, you can't disprove it. But I mean, some have more evidence than others, I think. And I would say,
well,
I mean, obviously, I would say Christianity has more evidence than all of them. But I would have to hear the evidence for Hinduism and then, evaluate it.
So with what you're saying, though, is that there's more evidence to maybe support one thing versus another. That doesn't discredit the other religion, though, because there's still maybe evidences that suggest. So, I mean, I wouldn't say that you're... How can you be in total disbelief that one religion is false when there's still evidence that supports it?
Well,
Even though your
problem
interpretation is that that your religion maybe might have specific
well,
evidences that
we'll
you
never
might
have
support one.
absolute certainty about anything, but if we have an overwhelming amount of evidence that supports one religion over another, I think we should go with the one that has much
that's
more
the
evidence.
problem is there is no evidence because the Bible was written by man, and just because it references a lot of things that did happen in history doesn't mean that it's like magical, right? I could go write a history book, and in 2,000 years people could reference it and be like, oh yeah, this guy wrote down stuff that happened.
Sure.
So like the Bible, like, it's not evident, and in fact the whole basis of Christianity is the F word, faith. It's the belief in something without evidence to back it up. So there is
that
no
isn't
absolute proof.
that isn't really the definition that probably any Jew before Christians and even Christians would use, is faith with no evidence at all. I mean, if you look at the stories in the Gospels as far as the disciples verifying that Jesus had risen from the dead, clearly they relied on some evidence. And they weren't just asked to believe that Jesus had risen from the dead, even though the tomb was still closed up and, it stunk or something,
But outside of the Bible, where's the evidence for that?
Yeah, because I can write anything I want. But
Outside of the Bible, where's the evidence for what?
The resurrection.
I think...
What other text was it written in? Where did the apostles write their testimonies in?
The apostles disagree with each other on many things.
Because you can't use the Bible as your reference. If you're trying to prove the Bible's true, you can't use it as your reference for truth.
Well, if you're trying to prove the resurrection is true, then you can use the Bible as a source, as long as you determine that it's reliable.
It's the only source. So, I mean, outside of that, what is the other source?
How do we know the Bible's true? Because it says it's true.
There's some other sources as far as, like, typically for... typically for the resurrection...
So.
Yeah, typically for the resurrection, you're not just positing necessarily Jesus rose from the dead. You're positing, Christians will posit a list of things that we know to be true about what happened. And then from there, they'll make an inference to the best explanation, and obviously Christians will land on Jesus resurrecting from the dead. So, I mean, you've probably heard this type of thing before, but... so, they'll posit that there was an empty tomb. that the disciples claimed to see Jesus, that they died for their beliefs, that Paul converted on the road to Damascus after seeing a vision of Jesus, different things like that, and obviously you can keep going on with the list, and eventually you take this list of facts that you can be very historically sure about, and most scholars are historically sure about them, and say what best explains these things, what most simply explains these things, especially. And I would say it's the
that's the
resurrection.
interesting part, that when the way you say that, it's like, so you're referencing testimony that came from the Bible, and then say, well, it's historically accurate. And that's where I ask, where's the other texts? Where are the other materials that make that historically accurate? And I don't believe that historians uniformly say, yes, this happened. There is no.
Well, they don't say the
other
resurrection
evidence
happened, but I'm saying all
outside of
those
the Bible.
facts that I listed.
But even then,
but
I'm still asking, where
it's just
did
coincidence.
you? Where are these other? What are the other sources you're referencing here?
Yeah, so for one, you don't necessarily need other sources to evaluate the source of, like, even the Gospels. So, I mean, you can use different criteria that historians use to evaluate something like the Gospels, their reliability, their intent to
Okay, so
tell
then
the
what
truth.
is that? What is that? And so just whether you think they told the truth or not.
Not whether you think,
that-
you can apply certain criteria to them.
I don't see that, again, falls into the faith category of, well,
I mean, it's a historical effort. I mean, it's not faith. It is evidence-based.
Can I interject for a second?
Yeah.
I have 2 history degrees. The historical consensus is that Jesus as a person existed. None of the other stuff he actually did. No one agrees on that. And anything that would be considered by gospel has nowhere near enough merit that we would consider anything else from the historical record for. Nothing.
In 1,000 years, they'll say that the Mormon golden plates that the dude found in his yard.
That-
under
exactly
their
that.
historical
What was
record.
your claim, poetic degree? That what about the historicity of the Gospels? I'm trying to figure out what you're actually
what
saying.
happened in them has no historicity to it whatsoever.
At all?
Outside
it
of the
doesn't.
Bible?
Do you think
no,
that Jesus was crucified?
That they came up with 140 years later, that was written about. Sorry, 120 years later. We don't actually know about that. We just know that
You
there
don't
was
know
a
if-
small cult
What-
leader, and I use cult in not the bad way, but in a small religious group that had a small following, that had different beliefs than the norm, that person existed. We
Yeah.
actually don't know much
Well,
about it
I mean,
besides literally decades later.
The scholarly consensus by far is that Jesus was crucified. So obviously we can know that. I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with Bart Ehrman, who's a New Testament scholar at UNC Chapel Hill. I mean, there's interviews with him being asked, was Jesus crucified? What do you think about these people who don't think Jesus was even crucified, or that Jesus is even a real person? And he's saying those people are basically making themselves look foolish. You need to stop saying that. So, I mean, to say that we can't know anything about Jesus' life is not the historical consensus at all.
That's not what they're saying. It's that the whole crucifixion part comes from one singular source 120 years later.
It's not 120 years later, and it's not a singular source.
I'm sorry, which Roman source was it?
Well, I mean, there's Josephus. He talks about it. Who's the other one? That's obviously a Jewish source.
There was a governor that says a small thing 20 years afterwards, and then there's actually written about a little bit more over 100 years after that. There's not much to go on besides there's
The
a little bit
Gospels
written
are
that the
dated
guy
around
existed.
30 to 70 years afterwards. So it's not those aren't 120.
No. I'm talking about I'm talking about
Non-biblical
like
sources.
non-biblical.
Right, but-
Completely has nothing to do with the actual sources.
Well, there's
in
no
it.
reason to
It's
throw out the biblical
government
sources.
sources after the fact from the Roman Empire.
Yeah, there's no reason to throw out the biblical sources, which are going to be obviously the
You have
closest
to, because it's like referencing
No, you
the
don't.
Mormon
And this is
Bible
where
when you're
this is
arguing
where I
against
was going
Mormon.
with Guy Renda.
You
so
need secondary sources to back
can't
up
use
the primary
your-
source.
No, so
You're-
if you had just the Gospels, you could absolutely determine with high probability that Jesus was crucified.
No,
The reason for that is because you can use different criteria, particularly in this case, the criterion of embarrassment, which is basically this idea that if there's an embarrassing detail in the story that, like, you know, doesn't necessarily serve the writers well, then it's more likely to be true. And in this case, nobody would just invent the story in the first century of a crucified Jewish Messiah, because that was totally antithetical to what the Jews were looking for at all. And really, I mean, it was a laughing stock for the Christians to have their Messiah be crucified and still follow him. I mean, the first depiction of Jesus was
it's martyrdom, though.
It's actually Roman graffiti of a Roman who worshiped Jesus, but it's apparently some people around him were making fun of him, so they graffitied onto the wall a donkey on a cross and said, I think Alexios worships his God. You know, so crucifixion was not a good thing at all, and so nobody would make up that Jesus was crucified.
Do you know about the
Absolutely
Mormon
they
golden
would.
tablets that the dude found that nobody else has ever seen? That he copied down on a paper, and then that's their Bible.
Let me ask Guy Rennan really quick, and then I'll get right to you. Why do you think they absolutely would make up a crucified Messiah?
Martyrdom.
Yeah,
Martyrdom.
it's easy to sell.
Martyrdom will gather people and bring them to a cause stronger than just about anything else within human psyche.
Mhm.
You know, if
It
you have
can,
somebody
but
die
you
for
have
your
to
cause,
be
that
aware
as
of
good
that.
as it gets.
Yeah, you have to be aware, though, of that first century Jewish context where, being a crucified Messiah, it's an oxymoron. You know, it disqualifies you from being a Messiah in the first century.
No, it plays into the character of being sacrificed.
Right. I mean, that theology was subsequent to the event. Like, you know, Jesus was crucified. Like, they didn't have some theology that there was going to be some sacrificed human, and so we need to make up this guy. They saw the sacrificed human, and
makes
that's
a
where
good
the
story.
theology comes
And
from.
then made up all the part about the sacrifice, is what you're saying.
You say that, but it makes.
I mean,
a good
that's
story, though.
that's much more likely, I would say. Like, if I were an atheist, I would say it is way, way, way more likely that they saw Jesus sacrificed, and so they just made up all this theological stuff to explain that. Obviously, not sacrifice, but they saw Jesus crucified, so they made up all this theological stuff about sacrifice to explain all that. Then the other way around, because there's no evidence that first century Jews were looking for a sacrificed Messiah.
Either
We're getting down a rabbit
explanation shows that Jesus then did not exist as the Bible portrays him.
Well, you
Whether-
got to rewind.
Whichever side you go with there.
Right,
there's-
and obviously I was arguing as
all
an
of- all
atheist
of-
there.
But my point being is just like there is a lot of reason why you would want to portray him as a martyr in this case, and I think that does make a lot of sense in terms of the story and why you would want, you know, to convince the
Right, but not from the
the
beginning in the ancient
apostles
world.
to, because-
Wait,
If
we're in the
he-
weeds, guys.
If
We're in the
he
weeds.
was killed, you would want to portray him as a martyr to some degree because,
We-
you know, you could get a following or something. But I'm saying if there was no guy named Jesus, or, you know, let's say Jesus existed, but he was never crucified, nothing like that ever happened to him, you wouldn't want, if you could just make up any story, you'd want to make up that, you know, he did all these wonderful things. He
Well, then
like
nobody would believe
probably
it.
killed some Romans and then he went to heaven, and then just explain it, you know, just explain it
No.
just like how you explain the resurrection
Right.
story. Anyway,
So
you can-
Scientology, we all know it's a bunch of BS. It was
I
made
thought
up
you were
like
going to go with
50
the
years
golden
ago.
plates. I wanted to hear about the golden plates.
Well, no, I'm going
Go back
more
to that.
extreme. Scientology. I can do the golden plates with Mormonism. So the dude
Yeah, right,
went out in
right.
his yard, found these golden plates, read them, and then lost them, or God told him to destroy them, and then he wrote it down on paper, and then nobody else was allowed to see the golden plates but him. But he wrote all this Bible, and they add it to the Christian Bible.
Yeah.
Anyway, so we all know it's a bunch of BS because it's a new religion. But let's say in 2,000 years, there's people discussing whether Mormonism is real or not, right? Well, they say, well, look at all this historical text saying that in 2020, blah, 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 blah. It doesn't make any difference that this Bible is 2,000 years old and it's historical and evident. No, it's like it's still written down by people on a piece of paper and it contradicts itself a bunch.
Yeah, I mean, I think a big difference with that is if people saw our writings about Mormonism today, but 1,000 years from now, they would say this is what 200 years after the events about now. Whereas with the Gospels, we can look at them and say 30 to 70 years based on your dating. I mean, obviously, I would go with a shorter dating on
Well,
that.
that's the thing. All of the writings that are not in the Bible that reference Christianity, they all contradict and they all disagree, and some of them are just like there's really nothing there.
All of the
Outside of
thing,
the Bible, there's no evidence for Christianity.
right? I mean, I
Like,
think our
there's God.
primary source for Christianity, like I think things extra biblical are kind of supplements. You know, they can give us like a basic story. Like there's
But
several
you still need
historians.
the Bible. That's the whole point. Is you
Right.
have to have
You
the
have
Bible
to have the
to have
Bible to know
Christianity.
what happened, right? Yeah, because those
And
are
it
the
was written by
earliest
people.
reporters, right?
And
right.
I could go create the Bible. in
Right,
my
and
backyard.
that's where it comes in, where you have to apply some of these criteria for looking at historical documents to like suss out, you know, just like we do for any history. Like
No, you have
if
to have
someone
faith
just
in it.
writes a secular history, like an ancient secular history, we still have to kind of like look at their motivations, look at how they're writing. Yes, like compare them to other writers where we can, do different things to tell, like, you know, are they
No, my
trying to
point
tell the
is,
truth? Are
let's
they
take
being
the
Those
Bible.
actually have a historiography.
Let's take the
You,
Bible
you
and let's
can't
delete
have
it.
that with the Gospels.
Let's delete the Bible.
can't
It
have
doesn't
a his-
exist.
All right,
All
go
right.
ahead.
Just
Do
pretend
you know
the
what
Bible does
do you know what
not exist.
historiography is?
There's no Christianity. That doesn't. There's nothing.
Oh, did you have a? What'd you say, Darth Corey? Did you have a question in there?
Sorry.
I'm just saying that if we could reference other historical texts of any kind anywhere that made reference to these events, that said, you know, that somebody else had written it down and put it in some history book somewhere, that would be some great evidence. I just don't see how referencing the book that you of your faith and saying, well, it says it in here, so that makes it true.
Again, that's not what I'm
where
saying
I disagree. It's
necessarily.
like, I want to see any evidence you have that correlates to the Bible, but is not. You can't reference the Bible. If you reference any other text, that would be qualified evidence, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean the
But if you can
Bible
only
is
reference
just a
it in the Bible.
collection of accounts, letters, and stuff from the earliest Christian sources, right? Which are going to be the eyewitnesses of what happened, and so, or at least, you know, the closest we can get to that. And so, you know, I don't know why. Yeah, I mean,
So just in modern terms here, you know, it's like I could tell you a story about a guy who claimed to be Jesus after he came back, and he gathered a group of followers. He was then persecuted by the government and killed. And who's to say that story that happened in 1990? Was it 92 when Waco happened? David
Something like
Koresh
that.
and his followers. Who's
Yeah,
to
what
say
if he's
that his
Jesus?
story is not Jesus? But if you're told by the followers who believed in him, right,
mhm.
and the people who had a vested interest in him being the return of Jesus, who was again
Right.
persecuted by the government and then at that point burned to death.
Right.
But do you believe that David Koresh could have been the return of Jesus?
No,
I
but
haven't
when we look at the evidence in that particular case, I mean, we see most, if not all, of his previous followers now saying, "Yeah, I was duped. That guy was crazy. You know, he was manipulative in this way and that way. He took people's wives." Like,
What if
Right,
people
you know,
said that back then, but it never made it into
let's
the final
only
audit?
look at their letters.
well, we have no
and-
evidence
and
of that. So
No, no.
that's where we have to go off, like,
Let's-
what evidence we
let's-
have.
only look at their letters and the writings of the time, like when they were in his cult and they were following him. If we
Mhm.
look at what they wrote and what they texted people and stuff there, again, I'm still even just with this example, I'm still referencing so much stuff outside of any of their primary texts that the Branch Davidians had. So I'm still correlating to other materials, and that's what I'm looking for within when anybody says there's evidence that says that the Bible is accurate. Well, if the idea is we are proving that the Bible is accurate, you cannot use the Bible as your primary source to say the Bible's accurate. So
Yeah,
what
but
are
again,
the other sources that you're using to justify the accuracy of the Bible?
So we
I
would
You
can-
have.
can't prove some.
we can
You
do
can't
it
use
with so
something
many
that's
things here.
self-referential to
Well,
prove
here's the
something.
thing, we could-
It doesn't work
I mean,
that way.
We can look, like, we could look at, let's say we just had the Branch Davidians, I think that's what they're called, their writings, to explain what was going on in Waco. And I mean, we could look at those and see, like, are they multiply attested? Is there some type of embarrassing detail here? Is there something that someone wouldn't make up? Like, we can apply different criteria just like we do the Gospels to see, like, are they being legit? And we can also say, are they in a position to know what they're saying is true, right? Like, it sounds like you're evaluating the claim, like, David Koresh was or was not a prophet, whereas they're not really in a position to know if that's true unless, like, let's say like, 30 of them say that David Koresh, like, predicted some pretty impressive thing, and then, like, we dig into it, let's say even after David Koresh, goes crazy, half of them die, they're still claiming, like, okay, we know he was crazy now, but he still claimed something that was really impressive that came true, then I wouldn't have a problem with looking at that and not having any outside evidence because nobody else has heard it. I wouldn't have a problem looking at that and say, all right, he probably claimed something like pretty impressive that was true, Now I would have to fit that into my worldview somehow. Obviously, my worldview can handle the ability to prophesy falsely or prophesy, as a false prophet, like with the actual ability to prophesy. So I mean, I could fit that within my worldview, but I wouldn't necessarily have a problem as long as we critically evaluate the sources. You shouldn't have a problem with evaluating the sources that are there as eyewitnesses, even if all of those sources are, like, biased in the same way. You just have to sort through that bias, which is what we try to do with the Gospels.
Right, and I see that, but when you apply eyewitness to, like, modern legal things, eyewitnesses are the worst type of evidence you can have in a legal case. I mean, they really are, because what one person says happened, another person who was right standing next to them will tell you completely something different happened. Now, they're both telling the truth. They both believe what they saw as it happened. And in the same way that there are plenty of people who watch David, what's this, David Copperfield or whatever his fuck his name, that magician, or David Blaine, and look at his things and go, that's amazing. I watched it happen in front of me. I don't know how he did it, but we in a modern society have a certain level of skepticism to know that that's not real. But there are a lot of people who genuinely look at that and be like, no, this guy's got to be a real magician. He's got to have real magic because I saw it and I can't explain it.
Yeah,
So
I mean, I think
that kind of eyewitness is not reliable in the same sense here. That's why any sort of actual evidence would be nice. Things that's more or less subjective.
I mean, I do think eyewitness testimony is reliable, especially when they're like, even in court. I mean, if you have,
but it's not.
If you have three people who independently identify a killer, then that's pretty, like, that's probably going to end up putting the person in prison for murder.
Probably, but that's why we've had enough innocent people who then were exonerated by DNA evidence, which is absolutely, not subjective. It's hard evidence. That DNA evidence is there's only one way it's going to turn out. Three or four eyewitnesses can be wrong because what they're seeing is skewed by their perspective, by their biases, their what they want it to be. So it is, like I said, it is some of the worst type of evidence we can possibly have in a legal case.
Which is why we do have to critically evaluate, like, were the eyewitnesses in a position to know, like, with some level of confidence that what they were seeing is accurate, So, like, I mean, yes, if four eyewitnesses, like, catch a glimpse of somebody running out of the door, then obviously there's more room for them to all make a mistake on who they saw. But, if you establish, like, the reliability of the Gospels enough, to generally trust the accounts there, then you have...
There's the problem. How do you generally rely, or how do you establish the reliability?
Yeah,
and that's the thing. It's like,
I think you establish it... you establish it through some of those different criteria. So you see the embarrassing detail. You see that they don't change Jesus' words when they could. These are just like different things you could look at. You see that they do match up with known, like,
Hey, sorry, 1 second, Madam President. I'm sorry. Can you like mute for a second? You're like echoing back in.
That's all right.
Yeah, come on. Be
Um,
civil.
you see that they do match up with, like, the archaeological stuff that we find. They do match up. They seem to be reporting accurately the details that we can confirm them on. And so different things like that, I would say, boost our confidence that, these aren't just like made up stories, like whole cloth,
Just so I understand where you're coming from, what is one of those verified archaeological evidence? Just so I kind of understand what we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, whether it's like, you could say, I think one of the interesting things about the Gospels is that it's set in a time period where within 30 years, Jerusalem was destroyed, right, in 70 AD. And so you lose a lot of the kinds of details that you find in the Gospels. So it can be anything from, like, there's a pool of Siloam and the pool of Bethesda in John that were buried in 70 AD. And John talks about how many pools there were and how many porticos there were on these certain structures. And we've since dug them up, and they have that number, So clearly there's some type of eyewitness that goes back, like, to those type of things. And, same thing with, like, locations of towns and but even down to, like, customs. Like, you're talking about it talks about religious groups like the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Zealots and the scribes and elders and all that different type of stuff. And these kinds of distinctions were only really present pre-70 AD. After that, the Sadducees pretty much disappear from history because the temple's
air
destroyed.
Was amazing quality, which gives the stuff a good preservation.
And so, that's just
time.
another indicator that some of these, at least some traditions in the Gospels, go back very early. Whether it's archaeological or just like kind of cultural evidence that we know, like that they get correctly. Does that make sense?
And it does make sense. It's just, I guess where I'm sorry, hang on. I guess the thing for me is just like any book of fiction that we write now has, who is it? John Scalzi writes a lot about Los Angeles and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It's 100% accurate. I can go find all of the locations he talks about in my town and see them. Doesn't make any of that story true.
Right,
what
right.
I mean? It's like,
right.
Like,
yeah,
I can go to Doc Brown from Back to the Future. I can go to Doc Brown's lab right now. It's just over on Victory. It's just a mile and a half from where I'm standing right now. It was the location for the movie. Doesn't make it any more true that it was an actual place where a time machine was developed than that it was a place that existed there.
Right.
So we use locations within storytelling all the time.
Right.
But it's
the mind makes it real.
That doesn't
like
give me an evidence to say, okay, well, because this place had a bunch of pools or whatever, that Jesus made unlimited fish out of a basket.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean,
you see what I'm saying? You see what I'm saying? It's like I guess for me, I want evidence or some kind of reference to these events within other texts that somebody else went out and wrote about somewhere else. Because with the fish and loaves type thing, there was tons of people there that all benefited from this magical event, but it's not written about in any other historical or fiction or anything else outside of the gospel.
Well, I mean, that's an interesting one because Jesus is well known both in the Gospels and in extra biblical sources as a sort of miracle worker, or from the enemy's perspective, a sorcerer. Like whenever in the Gospels, obviously Jesus works miracles. In the Gospels, it records what the enemies of Jesus were saying against Jesus, and then giving like an apologetic against those. So like you have the Pharisees saying Jesus drives out demons like by his demons, like he drives out Satan by the power of Satan. And there's an apologetic in the Gospels, basically, with Jesus saying, basically saying like a house divided against itself can't stand. So this, this doesn't work, basically. But it doesn't make sense for Jesus to be responding to something that was, never said. And then even when you get beyond like the Gospels, the earliest Jewish sources on Jesus, and even some like more just like kind of I guess you could say secular, just outside of Christian historical sources, like Celsus, I know, is a historian, though he's a little bit later. But the early sources, Christian and non-Christian, when they reference Jesus, they'd say that he was, some type of wonder worker. Like they didn't have as much of a problem with that back in the day as we do, at least here in the West. But so I don't know. I think that's interesting. There is enemy attestation and things that confirm that Jesus was clearly doing something that impressed people, right? Like, and I think it becomes easier to believe too when you start adding some of these other components, like that aren't necessarily even focused on the Bible. Like when you start looking at cases of modern miracles, and you see that people have, put their hands on other people, prayed for them, and have pretty incredible things happen that are hard to explain. Then you have an analogy for what Jesus was doing, where you're thinking, all right, if Jesus's friends, enemies, and people who, didn't really know him that well were all saying that he did work some miracles, some were saying that he did it by demons, some were saying that he did it by God, and we have analogies for this in the present day, well, maybe Jesus was laying his hands on people and odd things were happening. We're not sure how to explain it yet, but if that makes sense. I think that's an interesting one because, yeah, Jesus is pretty well known as a miracle worker to everyone in the first century and a little bit after.
Interesting. I do think the analog to modern miracles is kind of interesting because I always like this one story when people say it's like, I prayed, my friend was sick and I prayed for him and he got healthy. And they leave, in modern days, they leave out the fact that was on a Z-Pack and that, that was the real cause of his turn in health.
Mm-hmm.
But I do say, with all of those, we pray for things, and when it doesn't happen, we say, well, it was just not meant to be. But when it does happen, we claim miracle, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I say, what if prayers work, show me the person who prayed for the amputee to get his leg back, and when that happens, that's a miracle, because there's nothing in modern science that could possibly explain how somebody got a leg back.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, there's a lot of things.
There's a million things that can explain a lot of the others, and a lot of modern miracles have been debunked across the board. Crying statues and all that stuff, generally come down to water leaks and shit.
Yeah. I mean, I think there are a few very well documented miracles that are, maybe not quite as hard to explain as a whole leg growing back. But still, I guess, in a sense they are, because there's no known naturalistic explanation for them. And they happen in the context of prayer. And so, yeah, I think looking at those is interesting. It definitely gives an analogy to Jesus performing those. Well, I think the other thing that I bring up to a point that you mentioned a lot is that, you mentioned that like not everybody is healed, obviously, and when it does happen, we say, oh, great, God's alive, and when it doesn't happen, we're like, oh, it's fine, but there is a sense in which basically what I say is that whether God answers prayer or doesn't answer prayer, it is evidentially lopsided, meaning that, like, and I use an analogy where imagine there's a bathroom stall that's closed, or maybe a private bathroom that's closed, and you want to know if somebody's in there because you need to use it. And so you knock on the door one time, and there's no answer on the other side. And so you knock again, and now there is an answer on the other side. Somebody says, Hey, I'm in here. So the fact that you've knocked twice. One time you didn't get an answer. One time you did get an answer. But those are evidentially lopsided. Like the fact that you did get an answer one time is very strong evidence that someone's in there. The fact that you didn't get an answer this time is evidence that someone's not in there, but it's weak evidence that someone's not in there, especially when you match it up with this. And that's kind of how prayer is. If there are prayers that end in miracles that are, impossible, or, at least for now impossible to explain naturalistically, even if there's just a handful, which I think there's a lot more than a handful, but even if there's just a handful, then it's very lopsided evidentially, if that makes sense. Like, you still have some grounds for judging that there may be something going on here, Does that make sense?
Yeah, and one of the first people to actually present to me that there are documented cases. So, just for my own thing, what can you give me one of them so I can look it up, because I'm curious to kind of see where you're coming from on this.
Yeah. I think one that I've looked into a fair amount, and there's a lot of material on, so it's a good one. Is there was a baby born with gastroparesis, which is basically just his stomach was paralyzed, and so he couldn't eat food for 16 years of his life, and basically he would have to either chew food and spit it out, or if he did, like, whatever he did swallow, even his own spit, would come out of a tube that he had inserted into his body. And there was another tube in him that he would feed himself through, basically, for his whole life. Like, literally never ate for the actual benefit of nutrition in his whole life. Should say there's no case of this ever resolving if it's from birth in this long term, right? This is a congenital condition. Obviously, it couldn't have started as a psychosomatic condition if he was an infant when it, like, from birth, this was a problem. Right. So basically, he goes to a prayer meeting with a guy who also has a pretty impressive story of healing that you can look up if you go down the rabbit trail. But obviously, he started like a ministry because of it. And essentially, the kid gets prayed for, feels kind of an electric jolt of some kind, and like feels his tubes shaking in his body, essentially. And then after that, he goes and eats a meal. And for the first time in his whole 16 years of life, the next day, it passes all the way through him, doesn't come out of his tube. And so he quickly after that gets things resolved. Gets the tubes taken out and lives a normal life, essentially. He's still alive today. It's a recent case. I think he's in his 20s, maybe 30s. Another noteworthy thing in this case is that there was no treatment to cure it. Like the doctors knew that this was a lifelong thing. So, and he was, doing okay with the feedings, although I think, like, he was fed very well. His parents took really good care of him, and then he did really well. But there is kind of a big risk of dying young with this condition, But anyway, so there was no treatment to cure it, because there is no treatment to cure it. So in that way, it's not like they did some like curing surgery and then he went to the prayer meeting and got healed. He was under the same conditions his whole 16 years of life. So anyway, that case is Chris Gunderson, if you ever want to look that up. There's tons of – it's a very, very popular case. I would even say probably the most popular case, at least. Maybe you could say the most popular case in Protestant circles, because I know there's a lot of popular Catholic miracles, but it's a very popular modern case. So there's a lot of interviews on it. There is a peer-reviewed case study of it that's done by Global Medical Research Institute, I think, is what the name of it is. So that's like it'll just use a bunch of fancy language and actually show you the documentation of, his medical reports and stuff like that. So, but yeah, that's a really interesting one. So, and I mean that would really be equivalent to, like, I mean, obviously his stomach was paralyzed from birth, so I would say that it's probably on par with like a paralytic in your legs from birth, if not more impressive than that, even with how complicated like the stomach would be. So yeah, it's an interesting case.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to take a look at. I'm glad you gave me his name because he couldn't have had gastroparesis because that actually does resolve and mostly works out for people. That's not the one, so it's got to be something different than that. So
I think it depends on the
that makes
kind.
sense.
I think some people get viral gastroparesis, and that sometimes resolves within like 2 years. But if it's this long term and congenital, then it won't resolve on its own.
Yeah, I
I'm pretty sure it's gastroparesis, but I can look up the
right. No, I'm going
actual
to look up
medical
his stuff,
report
and
here.
then I can get his stuff more directly because post-viral gastroparesis tends to resolve within a few years, while diabetic gastroparesis is often lifelong. So he could have had diabetic gastroparesis, but
I don't remember him
be
mentioning
interesting to see
diabetes, but
well, that's what I'm saying. It's like I'm just looking through health journals here real quick to get the etymology of the disease, but I can't find something that lines up to kind of the same way. Sorry, Madam President, do you mind muting? It's like I can hear my voice and it's making it really hard to talk. Sorry, my apologies. Thank you. Sorry about that. I just, like I said, I'm obviously I'm a skeptic, I'm a doubter, so I want to make sure that what I'm seeing, if I can get back myself into a corner that I can't answer my way out of. But,
I'd be interested.
I'm also an EMT,
so
so I mean, this kind of area is a little bit of my specialty. So.
Yeah. Oh, you're a what'd you say?
I'm an EMT.
Nice.
So,
well, cool. I think if I'm ever on and you end up going down the rabbit trail, because especially most skeptics, like they have no idea what you're talking about. Like, I mean, to be honest, when you bring up modern miracles as some evidence for theism, most people do jump to like, oh, do you mean like a crying statue or something? So it's rare to find someone who knows of a particular case, even the most popular ones like this one. Like,
I agree. I absolutely agree.
So it'd be cool to hear your opinion on it if you look into it. I know that'll take you more time than this, obviously. So
yeah, I mean, I could read one article real quick here and give my opinion, but that's not exactly a well researched argument and everything. But
yeah, I
like
mean, the peer reviewed journal of it is,
so.
I think it's Global Medical Research Institute, and if you just type that in and Chris Gunderson, it'll probably come up.
Well, I'm definitely going to take a look at it because it's nice to actually have an actual reference to look up.
Yeah, I definitely like to have the references. I mean, and the way I see it, like, obviously this, in my opinion, is a highly evidential case. But I mean, if you look on this, just the statistics of miracle reports, and I mean, to be honest, if you just lived in like a community of some kind of faith, like there are an incredible amount of people claiming miracles that.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And obviously some percentage, maybe even a large percentage of those are just going to be coincidences or just not verifiable, or so I mean there's going to be a gradation of very impressive cases, and then obviously the further you go down, like there's going to be a huge amount of maybe not so impressive cases. Like, doesn't mean they're not true, but we can't really verify them to the same degree, basically.
Right.
But, I mean, I think some of those can add some value. I don't think, for me, I mean, I don't necessarily, like, I've heard a lot of miracle stories that are pretty impressive from people that I trust that I'll never be able to verify on the scale of this type of, like this evidential level. But, it's people I trust. I have no reason to think they're lying to me, and their story is difficult to explain if they're telling the truth, So I think miracles it's probably one of, I mean, I'll talk about, other evidences and stuff, but it's probably a cornerstone of my faith, I would say, if I'm being honest. So